Welcome everyone. Welcome to the session on ACE TI Informed Practice number 2, Trauma Informed Organizations and Current Practice and Future Directions. Both Florian and I are the moderators for the session, and our speakers are skilled specialists in the field, including Dr. Sharon Lambert, Chief Superintendent Sue Clark, Superintendent Justin Srivastava, Kath Randall, Margaret Williams, Jane Galbraith, Steve Archer, Rhiannon Kirk, and Emma Davis. We have speakers from a range of backgrounds and professions: a trauma specialist psychologist, members of the UK Police, An Garda Síochána, headmaster of a trauma-informed community school, and a teacher and behavioural lead. Both Florian and I work for Th3, an international youth organisation advocating for the rights of young people who use drugs and the provision of youth-centred health and social services. Florian is a project manager for the Youth Consortium of HIV+ youth organisations, and I am the International Communications Officer. Throughout this session, feel free to send any questions you have into the chat box, and our speakers will be able to answer them as their videos are being played. On to you, Florian.
As an organisation working with and for young people who use drugs, we are acutely aware of the very real effects of adverse childhood experiences and other traumas on drug use patterns, adverse health and social outcomes, and their implications for law enforcement. We're also optimistic that adverse childhood experiences and traumas can be prevented, and that people who have experienced trauma can be supported, leading to ever-growing public health and community safety benefits. Multi-agency and intersectoral cooperation between all stakeholders, including management and frontline workers in law enforcement, public health, education, civil society, communities, families, and the young people themselves around these aims, is central to realizing this vision. Our speakers today will speak to their work and how we may move forward together towards a more trauma-aware and informed future. On that note, I would like to introduce you to the first speaker, Dr. Sharon Lambert from the University College of Cork, School of Applied Psychology in Cork, Ireland. And Lindsay, could you please play the video?
Welcome to my presentation. My name is Dr. Sharon Lambert from the School of Applied Psychology in University College Cork in Ireland, and I'm involved with some speakers that will be coming along later from Quality Matters and An Garda Síochána, and they'll talk about a specific project that we were involved in. And just to preface that, I wanted to start off by talking about the case for trauma-informed practice in public services. So what I wanted to think about was, why do we need to have trauma-informed practice in all public services? So I'm a researcher who works in the psychology department in a university, and prior to that I worked in several community-based organisations with lots of different people. And one of the things that we realised quite quickly was that psychological trauma is something that happens to lots of people. And in order for us to ensure that the people who need our services the most can access them, we have to design our services for everybody. So the groups of people that I'm particularly interested in terms of research and looking at psychological trauma and how we can design systems and services to meet with their needs are young people, members of the travelling community, people who use drugs, people experiencing homelessness, and also frontline workers. What are their experiences of their own personal traumas? What are their experiences of secondary traumatic stress? And how can organisations respond to that? So what do we mean when we talk about psychological trauma? So it's the unique individual experience of an event in which the individual's ability to integrate his or her emotional experience is overwhelmed, or the individual experiences a threat to bodily life or sanity. So I suppose the most important thing for us as psychologists when we're talking about psychological trauma is that it's a unique individual experience, and several people might experience the same event, but how that will impact on them will be different for each individual. There are different types of traumas. There's your single incident trauma, so a once-off, unexpected and overwhelming event. Could be a medical illness or an accident or witnessing something horrific. Your complex and repetitive trauma and developmental traumas, so those traumas that occur particularly during childhood in the context of caring relationships or interpersonal relationships that ought to be caring but perhaps are not. Then you have intergenerational trauma, so the impact living, particularly on children, of living with somebody who's a trauma survivor and the behaviours that can be passed on. Then you have your historical trauma, like childhood sexual abuse in Ireland. It's very much in the media at the moment in relation to mother and baby homes and residential schools. And also, of course, racism as a trauma. So the experience of immigrants, refugees, and other ethnic minorities. So in terms of adversity during childhood, we know that adversity during childhood can impact on a child's social, emotional, and cognitive development. When I think about adversity during childhood, or ACEs, when I think about what is an ACE is anything that occurs in your lifetime that impacts on your development, or impacts on your ability to get your needs met and to stay within systems and services that you require. So types of traumas that we might think about are bullying, poverty, experiences of racism, experiences of multiple and traumatic death, living in an unsafe home, so that's your exposure to abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, having a poor experience of the educational system. So there's lots of young people who struggle to stay in mainstream education not because they're the problem, but because sometimes mainstream education isn't set up to support young people who've experienced a lot of trauma. So they perceive these children as being quite challenging or difficult, when in fact they're trying to express, their emotional distress. We know that education is one of the biggest protective factors for young people. So not being able to stay within those systems, or those systems not being able to hold you, is a huge adversity, particularly for children. Experiences of the care system, exposure to community violence, and food scarcity. That's not an exhaustive list. There's lots of other things that happen that are traumatic and can have an impact on a child and how they move forward. So in terms of why do services need to think about this? So we know, that the impact of stress and trauma on the brain means that your fight or flight system is activated. And when that's activated, it causes blood loss from the prefrontal cortex. So blood withdraws from the prefrontal cortex so that you can respond to the trauma or the stressor. So I'm in danger, I'm driving in my car and a deer runs out in front of me. My brain will activate my fight or flight response system to keep me safe. And in that moment, it withdraws blood from my prefrontal cortex, which is my thinking brain, my brain that helps me to analyze problems and learn ahead and learn from experiences. So sometimes when people present to our services, they present in chronic levels of stress, and everything that's required to be able to navigate our service, particularly our prefrontal cortex, is just not online in the way that it should be. And, you can have people who can be quite emotionally dysregulated. They might appear to be aggressive, but in fact, they're doing exactly what they should be doing because they're quite traumatized and quite stressed out. What happens in many instances, of course, is that services exclude them from the system. Then they say, look, we can't have so-and-so come into our service because we can't deal with their aggressive behaviour. So what happens in reality is that the people who need us the most struggle the most to access the services that they need, because many public services are not set up to understand what's going on. So here's an example. You have on the left here, you have a child who has not experienced a huge amount of adversity, and you can see that there's lots of activity here in the prefrontal cortex. On the other side, less so. So if you imagine these two children going to school in the morning, one of these children is wired for learning on that day. They've plenty of neural activity in the areas of the brain required for learning. This other child here, however, is wired for danger. So they might appear quite withdrawn at one end of the scale, or else they might appear quite agitated and aggressive at the other end of the scale. And how we respond to that and how we can hold those children in our systems and services has a huge consequence for that child and a huge consequence for the rest of us further down along the line in terms of the cost, the personal cost to people who've been impacted by trauma, and also the societal cost of not intervening soon enough to provide people with systems and services that meet their needs. So other things that can happen is an impact on your endorphin levels. So there can be a decrease in the ability to self-soothe when you've experienced a lot of trauma. So one of the things that people who find it difficult to soothe themselves, something that they do is they reach for things outside of them to help them manage their own emotions. So they might use drugs or alcohol. We're often very judgmental about people who use drugs or alcohol to a problematic level, when in fact, many of them are doing what they have to do in order to be able to survive the trauma that they've experienced. Another important issue in relation to high levels of trauma and stress is that it can impact, with the endorphins, it can impact on your ability to form attachments. So because there's, a huge scramble for resources when you're delivering services, lots of services now offer 6 to 8 sessions and then you move on. We have to ask ourselves if that's appropriate for everybody. There are some people who will struggle to connect with those in our services, and it will take them much longer for them to be able to relax and settle in and to be able to use our services. So 6 to 8 sessions will not work for lots of people who really need us. So if we're really to think about the science of trauma and the science of stress and how we apply that to services, we need to think about, does the service that you provide require a type of intervention or a type of work that can only occur in the context of a strong relationship? If that's what's required, then we need to think about, are the services meeting people's needs by not giving sufficient appointment times? The other thing that can happen is there can be an impact on your dopamine hormone. So you'll hear people saying things like, so-and-so isn't motivated to change, or so-and-so isn't motivated to come to school, or so-and-so isn't motivated to give up crime, so-and-so isn't motivated to stop using drugs and alcohol. So if you're somebody who's experienced chronic stress and chronic trauma, your motivation hormone is impacted. So your motivation is in your boots. So there are lots of people who really struggle to be motivated to change. And what our job is to say, well, I understand the science of trauma and stress, and I understand that not everybody I meet is motivated to change, because they might not have the tools required for that. So I'm going to meet them where they're at and bring them along on a journey so that we can increase their motivation and increase their engagement with our services. So why should we do all of this stuff? The reason why we should do this is because we know that there are high levels of trauma in particular groups, and particularly groups who are likely to come into contact with the criminal justice system. So just to give you an example, this is a study that we did with people experiencing homelessness in Cork City. And you can see here in green, this is the adverse childhood experiences profile of the general population. But here in yellow, you have the adverse childhood experiences profile of people experiencing homelessness. So what we know is that people experiencing homelessness in the city where I live have walked significantly different steps during their childhood and adolescence than the general population have. And they really, really struggle to use public services because they are dealing with stigma and often present quite emotionally distressed or emotionally dysregulated, and people exclude them from services. And that's a failure to understand the impact of trauma on the brain and on behaviour. Also, we looked at ACE profiles, adverse childhood experiences profiles, in a group of adults who were attending an adult residential addiction treatment service. What we found was people who had higher levels of ACEs were more likely to think about suicide, were more likely to have been imprisoned, were more likely to be IV users, and were more likely to have started injecting at a younger age. They were more likely to have left school earlier. So you can see the interactions with all of the different various services, the criminal justice service, the education service, mental health services, etc. And people with higher levels of adversity were more in contact with those services, but also really struggling to navigate those services. In relation to women in contact with probation service, we found very similar profiles, so much higher levels of childhood adversity than within the general population. Issues around mental health and addiction, which of course are responses to trauma. So we have to stop thinking about people in the criminal justice system who are in addiction as having, you know, this as having some kind of a moral failure when it comes to being in addiction. These are people who are trying desperately to medicate their emotional pain, and substances work very well to do that. They medicate people's emotional pain. That's why people continue to use them. And unfortunately, they no longer work. Those substances don't work the way that they did the first few times that people started using drugs and alcohol, and then it becomes a problematic level, is sometimes the reason why they're involved in crime. So we have to stop viewing that substance use issue as a criminal issue. It's a response to trauma and a response to mental distress. I won't talk too much about this because Aoife Dermody from Quality Matters is going to talk about the study that we did, and Chief Superintendent Colette Quinn from An Garda Síochána will also talk about young people in Ireland and their levels of adversity. But what was interesting was that they're young people who are involved with the criminal justice system in Ireland. Their ACE profile is more similar to adults experiencing homelessness than it is to the general population. So we have to think about the systems and services that are around young people and what we can do more to design those services so that they can hold young people who are struggling. So the education piece is a perfect example. The longer we can keep young people in education, the better the outcomes for them. But there are too many young people who fail to stay in education because the models are not set up to keep them there and keep them emotionally safe. And how do we know that young people feel like that? Because when we did a study where we talked to young people who were using high numbers of illegally sourced benzodiazepines, what they told us as the primary reason for taking those, it wasn't, you know, for fun. They weren't going out at weekends having fun and partying and using benzodiazepines. They were using benzodiazepines because it helped them to just not feel. It helped them to medicate the emotional pain that they were really struggling to manage. So in terms of designing systems and structures and why they need to be trauma informed, we have lots of evidence about the levels of trauma that exist within different groups of individuals and why we need to design our services so that all of those people can use our services a little bit better. Also, within services themselves, if you have a trauma-informed service, you have a service that not only understands the needs of your service users, but also the needs of your staff. So staff who are constantly working with people who've experienced high levels of trauma are at risk for compassion fatigue and secondary traumatic stress. So compassion fatigue is something that you get when you get tired from working in jobs that require high levels of compassion. Ideally, you should have days when you have high levels of compassion satisfaction, so you're delighted with your job, and then on another day, you're driving home from work and you're really tired and you're worn out and you have compassion fatigue, and hopefully those balance themselves out. But in organisations where you're dealing with high levels of traumatised people, sometimes there's not enough compassion satisfaction and you just have compassion fatigue. When that happens, then you're at risk for secondary traumatic stress and burnout. We conducted a survey of frontline professionals, and we looked at their own levels of adverse childhood experiences and their professional quality of life. One of the things that was very interesting about this study was, I suppose it wasn't a surprise that people who were in particular helping roles had higher levels of adversity in childhood themselves. So, you know, counsellors, psychotherapists, addiction counsellors, psychologists, sector reported having higher levels of ACEs. But what was really interesting, it was that in the criminal justice sector, there were quite low levels of childhood adversity reported, but very high levels of burnout. And when we looked across all of the occupations, one of the things that we hypothesized was that organizations that were more inclined to be more trauma informed, like mental health services, the staff there actually had higher levels of adversity themselves, but lower levels of burnout, because the organizational structure is different. In organizations like the criminal justice system, that are not necessarily trauma informed, but you have workers in there dealing with the same client groups. That seems to be having a much bigger impact on the staff than in other organizations. So one of the ways you can combat that is by having a trauma-informed service. Something that I think is really important about saying about trauma-informed services is that that's a journey that you need to get to. It can take years for some organizations to become trauma-informed. Maybe you don't want to be trauma-informed, maybe you just want to be trauma-sensitive, but it's really important to know that attending a 2-hour workshop on an introduction to trauma does not make an organization trauma-informed. That makes you trauma-aware, and you need to go through all of the other steps. So how do we respond then? So if we want to respond so that we can support service users with high levels of trauma, and we can support our staff who may be experiencing secondary traumatic stress from the work, we need to have an organizational culture that understands and respects the fact that some people can present as challenging. It does not mean that they are challenging people. It means that they are experiencing their world in quite a scary way. And making sure that you have appropriate supervision. This is not line management. Supervision is not line management. Supervision is a reflective space that is a safe space for staff to be able to explore the impact of the work on them. And that would include reflective practice sessions. And by looking at your organization and seeing what can you do to make it, if you can make it more trauma informed, at least more trauma aware or more trauma sensitive, it will cost you less money in the long run. If you have an organization that's better equipped to serve its service users and its staff. Trauma informed organizations, and Aoife from Quality Matters might talk about this, they evaluated a project that it was it's a shelter for people experiencing homelessness, and they implemented trauma-informed practice there, and they had a reduction of 60% in the number of incidents that were reported. So it makes the workplace less stressful, which means that you're going to have rewards then in terms of staff sick, staff turnover, other HR issues, etc. And by practicing self-compassion and having an organisation that promotes self-compassion. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sharon. Lindsay, could you play Justin's video, please? Lindsay? Sorry, 2 minutes. Lindsay, could you play Justin's video, or can you hear me, Lindsay?
Yeah, it should be sharing now. Give me 1 second. Sorry.
Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Chief Superintendent Sue Clark. I'm head of the Lancashire Violence Reduction Network. I'm presenting this presentation with my colleague, Superintendent Justin Shrivastava. We're going to talk about the journey that we've had within Lancashire to becoming a trauma-informed county. Many of you will know the history of the public health consensus, and hopefully you'll have started to develop that within your own areas. You'll see there the key points of that document, and also the key points of the work that we're currently doing, focus on prevention, partnerships, the whole population, and particularly want to talk this morning about the causes of the causes, as well as that sort of the obvious sort of public health links across the board. So the Lancashire Vision is for every person living and working in Lancashire to feel safe from violence and violent crime. You can see there are 4 strands of our mission statement, but particularly draw your attention to number 4, which focuses on the culture. For us, this is the most important part of this work, because actually, if we don't change the culture within organisations across public and third sector, then we will not achieve our goal of getting right to the end of that roadmap and becoming a trauma-informed county. So we're working across this, across the multi-agency, but also, most importantly, within communities and working with people with lived experience. So just to recap, you'll know that the public health approach looks at tackling violence as a preventable disease and looking at the reasons why people commit violence. Those reasons very much being related to poverty, people's early start in life, and actually having lethal absences of hope, as one of my colleagues from Glasgow often describes it. So this work is focusing on helping people improve their lives, also the lives of their whole communities and their families, which is a key part of it. This is probably the slide I'll focus on the most, because it shows you, within Lancashire anyway, we've done a serious violence needs assessment, which has looked at public health data, deprivation data, as well as crime data. And we can see there the key factors, and it's great to have this data to show to multi-agency audience if we're trying to convince people that a public health approach is the one that should be taken. So we've got the data that shows that education, employment and training, those high levels of poor educational attainment,
Just going to restart that because we're having some problems here.
poor mental health, high levels of young people without education or any kind of hope in terms of training or employment, linked to substance misuse and mental health again. The parenting aspects, which we're focusing on a lot. We're working on a whole life course here, so from pre-birth right across and up to those, and including those giving hope to those who've offended who are coming out of prison. So obviously you'll have this slide so you can focus on those other crime areas yourself. I'll just draw your attention to the fact that we have listened to people within Lancashire in the community who tell us some of the key aspects of this are around fear and public safety. So we do need to address those as well through that public health approach. This is just a summary basically of what I've already said, but focusing there where you can see the arrow on that kind of trauma-informed and that whole life course approach that I referred to before. As I say, our approach is that being trauma-informed in Lancs is a red line for us. We are not saying that we are there right now, but what we are saying is that everybody, all our agencies and services are now working towards this, and we're working together and seeing the workforce particularly as the key enabler to achieving this. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague now, Justin, to do the rest of the presentation.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Justin Srivastava. I'm the lead for workforce development for Trauma Informed Lancashire. And I just want to talk to you a little bit about our workforce development journey. We are really keen to learn from those with lived experience, and it's a massive part of our work that underpins what we do on a day-to-day basis. But whilst we've got the 8 principles that you can see on the slide there, we also want to understand violence, because only by understanding the causes of violence and taking that public health approach can we then implement multi-agency integrated partnership ways of doing business around primary, secondary and tertiary prevention. So moving on. Our journey has been quite a long one. Back in 2012, we worked very closely with Mark Bellis and the public health team back in Blackburn, Lancashire, and they were looking at one of the first UK-based ACEs studies and looking at what happened in America and then whether or not the same findings were found over here in England. But it was done in Lancashire in Blackburn. That then led to quite a significant ACEs movement. There was a multi-agency partnership movement and a community movement between 2012 and 2018. And then in 2018, we were fortunate enough to get all of our system leaders from across the system to start looking at Lancashire beyond just ACEs and saying, okay, ACEs are part of the jigsaw, but so is trauma, because there are many traumatic incidents that we deal with on a day-to-day basis that aren't necessarily ACEs but need to be dealt with. And the final part of the slide there, you can see, and it touches on what Sue mentioned earlier around the needs assessment, is that we were really keen to use our needs assessment to understand what our risk factors are across the whole of Lancashire, and that then allows us to develop our workforce development strategy that I'm going to come on to next. So what does the workforce development strategy mean to us? Well, there's an awful lot of resources you can see on that slide, and I don't propose to go through all of them, but they are all available on our website. The two that I'd like to direct you to today are the Trauma-Informed Organisational Development Framework. And this was a request from our leaders across Lancashire saying, we understand the why. We understand why trauma-informed approaches are really important, but can you help us a little bit with the what and the how? So we put together an evidence-based self-assessment tool that allowed leaders to self-assess their teams or their areas around how trauma inform their team's practices. The second point I'd like to mention to you on that slide is the outcomes framework. It was really important to us that we had common outcomes and common goals across Lancashire. So we developed a multi-agency integrated outcomes framework that broadly represents the needs assessment, but looks at our direction of travel between now and 2025. But it's important that we had a longitudinal approach to it, not just looking at the here and now. So what does that actually mean in practice? Well, again, we've got an awful lot of day-to-day trauma-informed resources and practices that you can see on the screen there. But the two that I'd like to directly to today is in the bottom right-hand corner, life through a lens. Our practitioners were saying to us, well, can you help us a little bit with the how? Can you help us a little bit to how to develop trauma-informed practice at a bespoke level for policing, nursing, social services, but also at multi-agency partnership level? So we've developed a training product that's a train-the-trainer product. It's multi-agency, and we've made bespoke ones as well. And then we've also had them academically evaluated by a local university. One of the key things that came from that academic evaluation was that 90% of practitioners felt that their practice had changed as a result of that trauma-informed product. I also want to direct you towards Mia's story, which is in the top right-hand corner there. That is a true story from a young girl in a primary school who works with one of our head teachers. And she was talking about what her life has been like since her father was put in prison. We've used that as that resource in our local schools, but we're also using it in our custody suites, in a custody suite setting, and we're looking at using it in our prisons and probation in order to ensure the trauma-informed journey is explained through the eyes of a child as well as through the eyes of professionals. And later on today, you're also going to hear from colleagues in the NHS, talking about our blueprint work and how we're working closely with the health system. So what are we trying to achieve? Well, we've got a roadmap there that you can see. So phase 1, trauma aware, phase 2, trauma sensitive, phase 3, trauma responsive, and phase 4, trauma informed. It's a long journey, and different agencies that we work with are at different parts of that journey. But you know what? That's okay, because that's part of our strategy, because it is a long-term strategy for us.
Thanks, Justin. So you can see there our contact details on the screen. We are on Twitter, and you can see there details of the website and addresses, etc. So please contact either of us anytime, and hopefully we'll catch you all in the Q&A. Thanks very much.
Hi, Lindsay. So I think if you can play Kat's video would be great.
Hello, my name is Catherine Randall. I am the Deputy Head of Safeguarding for NHS England. My responsibilities include the assurance and accountability of safeguarding across England. I have been a nurse for 35 years and I am passionate about making a difference. I've been working with the integrated system in Lancashire around tackling serious violence for the last 12 months. This work is all about saving lives. It's about trust, it's about relationship, it's about collaboration and making every contact count and really making and working together. I would now like to introduce you to Elizabeth Ratcliffe.
Hello, good morning everybody. My name is Elizabeth Ratcliffe. I am Deputy Director for Quality and the North West Regional Safeguarding Lead for NHS England. I too have had experience in working in the Lancashire and South Cumbria healthcare system. I have been a nurse for 42 years, and this piece of work, developing the VRM blueprint, has been exceptional. It's been exceptional because we've had to blend partnerships, collaboration, work together on supporting the reduction in crime and violence within our society. I'm looking forward to continue working with this agenda and taking it forward and progressing. I'd like now to introduce you to Margaret Williams.
Good morning, everyone. So my name's Margaret Williams. I'm an Executive Lead Director for Safeguarding and also a clinical nurse. And I'm across an area of the UK known as Lancashire and South Cumbria, which has a population size of 1.7 million. Trauma Informed, as you've heard, is a whole system organisational change process that aims to reduce how an organisation's practices may inadvertently exacerbate an individual's, families or community's response to trauma. Health very much wanted to partner with police and local authority councils in this aim for a trauma-informed Lancashire and South Cumbria. The roadmap displayed shows the key touch points of the journey so far. Fundamentally, it follows the key stages of any change programme. We absolutely must be able to tell the story that connects hearts and minds. We must build energy, galvanise momentum. We must have a starting point and a future vision. No one would wish to see or experience the emotional and psychological trauma of an adverse event. But unfortunately, some of this does happen and some of us will experience this. So collectively, let's respond. Let's build awareness and skills, insights into our teams and beyond our teams. To conclude, we are committed to our communities, to our system and to our partners. We are on a journey to forming a Lancashire and South Cumbria trauma-informed system. Thank you very much.
That's great too. Could you play Jane's one, Lindsay, please?
Hello, I'm Jane Galbraith, head teacher at Latham High School in Skelmersdale in the northwest of England. I'm here today to talk to you about the role of trauma-informed schools in policing, and want to give you a little bit of background on our school as a starting point, as a point of reference. We're a smaller than average secondary school in the northwest, serving some of the most deprived wards in England, and we serve a school population which has approximately 50% pupil premium at the current time. This look at trauma-informed work and that development that we've done at schools across the last 4 years is very much driven by working alongside the police and alongside public health to look for a vehicle to drive school improvement and community strength and partnerships. What we wanted to do at Latham and in our wider community in Skelmersdale was use trauma-informed practices to look at behaviour management, to look at personal development in a way that would improve behaviour sustainably for both the community and for the school. And in the widest possible sense, in our families, and ensure that there was a resilience there to deal effectively with adversity, both in our personal lives and in our educational lives for the children that we serve, without needing to find that they were resorting to violent behaviour or crime. In considering how we would go about that, we worked with public health, with Sue Irwin and Embrace, and with our community partners through the police, to very much look at the root causes of issues for our pupils, for their families, and the wider community. We wanted to ensure that we were building strong and positive relationships and developing trust, especially in the wider community, and looking at how those role models available to us in our local area, particularly through the community policing team, could be used to foster those relationships and to improve relationships that were broken at the time of us starting this piece of work. We looked very much at how we could drive at high expectations for all, and by asking why, asking all of the time, why are things happening? Let's understand that, let's show empathy, and then let's examine how it can be better, how it can be improved, not tolerating unacceptable behaviour, but seeking to understand it and work collaboratively to drive improvement in our personal behaviours at every level and in the widest possible sense. And that is what we set out to achieve, wanting to show a level of care, of compassion, but through the highest possible standards. It's very much our belief that the strength and the strongest form of care we can show to our community is to challenge it to be the very best it can be and have those high expectations. So what did this look like for us at school, and where was that relationship between the school and policing particularly? Well, it involved us looking at ourselves first and foremost, using a trauma-informed lens very much to look at our own behaviours, our own governance, the way we recruited staff at the school, the way we then did induction with the staff, and how we then used those key people to build our community partnerships. It meant stopping and understanding and developing training for every partner, both in school and in the wider community, to look at how trauma, how adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, affect young people, affect all of us, not just young people, but all of us, in our brain development and our ability to learn, and therefore our ability to regulate our emotions and the way we go about tackling things, but especially things which challenge us or create a sense of adversity. We knew we needed to provide consistent approaches, firm, agreed boundaries, all of which would lead in time to reductions in offending in the community. Boundaries which also gave a sense of care, a sense of belonging, and in these very difficult times at the current moment for us all in this global pandemic, a sense of belonging that goes beyond being actually in the building, but knowing that you've got an attachment to something even when you're not tangibly there. And that's been vital to us in terms of sustaining relationships in periods of lockdown and sustaining productive relationships with our community police officers to support our families whilst they're having to be at home for so much of the time, and helping them to respect the rules of the pandemic, of the lockdown situation in our local area. So very much talking there about the fact the police role here is key. We learn a lot as an organisation, as a school and as a wider community together about restorative approaches. And again, not ever considering this as a soft option, which I know some people see as a tension with trauma-informed practice and high standards, but actually truly restorative, truly thoughtful, responsible approaches here force individuals to look at their own behaviour, take some responsibility for their actions, understand that things go wrong and show a level of tolerance there of the fact we can all make a mistake, but crucially we learn from it for the future. And if we do that and we take prompt and we take positive action together, collaboratively, and we drive our parents to do the same in a secondary school setting with the support of agencies where necessary, we can prevent, or at least strive to prevent, negative and potentially criminal or violent choices in the future. That combination of things, that development of character, of belonging, because if we belong to that something there, we don't seek it out in a criminal organisation or in some way that means we're exploited, because there's something else to believe in and something to hang on to. And alongside all of that, we also have developed massively our careers guidance to look at positive choices for the future, to look at positive role models to ensure a more productive future for our young people to contribute to our local society, to their own communities, and have choices which again take away perhaps the attraction of some of the potentially criminal and violent routes that some of our young people were going down historically. So through doing all of that work and continuing to do that work, because it is ongoing, it is never ever a tick list, what's the impact we've seen over time? Well, the impact we've seen and the connections we can then make back to, we hope in time, the impact on our community policing is that our attendance to school has improved. Our parents are more supportive in our school community of knowing their children need to attend school and at the current time engage with their education whilst away from the building and learning at home. They're more able, they're more resilient, more able to understand and challenge their child's reasons for refusing or avoiding school, and more confident in seeking from us as a school and from other agencies such as the police, community safety team and PCSOs that support to help them parent more effectively, to then help their young people be more effective citizens making that contribution. You can see in the slide there significant increases in attendance to school in the academic year 2018-19, so prior to coronavirus hitting us so hard in this last almost 12 months now, but particularly in groups which are deemed vulnerable, such as the disadvantaged and those with additional needs. And that's led us to be able, by having those young people in school and not needing to chase them in, chase their parents up, it's then led us to redirect resources and make better use of resources both in the school and in the community to look at the things I referenced before. So careers lead information, looking at life choices, life chances, reduction in the chances that young people become involved in criminally exploited behaviours. So in school, we've also seen a significant reduction in exclusions from school. Again, a clear link we know over time to criminal behaviour, to behaviour which then presents a challenge to our community police colleagues, is by having young people out of school. And very much by looking through this trauma-informed lens, by looking at the work we've done, by always asking why, and all of those things that I've said, we've been able to reduce exclusion significantly, as you can see from the data there. We've also reduced permanent exclusion to less than half of what it used to be. And we know, unfortunately, that trajectory for young people who are permanently excluded from school is not a positive one. So all of those things we hope over time provide opportunities for the limited resources available for community policing to be redirected, we hope, to early intervention as well, rather than always responding to cases which have become so severe as to lead to permanent exclusion. So the wider impact for us and in the community has been very much that raising of aspirations, the belief that something can be better, it can be different, that there can be more choice. Because the immediate firefighting of having to deal historically with behaviour on the ground, challenging behaviours in the community, antisocial behaviours at night and at the weekends, truancy from school, those things have reduced for us in our local area. We are able to work far more collaboratively at looking at early help and prevention, identification early of those young people at risk of becoming exploited, and therefore seek to prevent that from happening for future generations. We know, and it's far harder to quantify, that having a true understanding of ACEs and trauma, and then showing young people how to regulate their emotions and their parents how to parent and the trauma in their approaches, will support future generations, will reduce offending, will provide the society in which we currently work, our community, with more capacity to be more positive and to give every young person choices for their future. More important, I think, than ever at the current time, in the challenges that every young person growing up will be facing in a very uncertain and challenging world because of the global pandemic that we're currently living through. In terms of that wider impact, we work and continue to work with our community policing colleagues to look at how we can drive those partnerships to be even stronger. We know and we feel very strongly that the system needs to be responsive and it needs to be proactive. And resourcing can be very, very difficult in terms of trying to find ways to make that possible. We believe at Latham that nothing is impossible. Sometimes you just have to drive an incredible amount of creativity to find a way to achieve things. But we know that very much that effective trauma-informed practice will reduce exclusion and negative behaviours in school and will reduce that behaviour in the community as well and allow us to get to a point where preventative measures can be put in place. We know that the resources available to us are helping us very much on a daily basis at the current time whilst we're in lockdown to drive positive relationships in our community, to use our community officers as role models when we go out to do home visits, for example, in a socially distanced way, and remove barriers that have been there historically and built up over time in some very hard to reach areas of our community. We've had great support through the pandemic for our safeguarding staff from our community partnership and policing, and it very much has helped us to build those relationships on the doorstep. I know that having school-based community police officers, even part-time, will strengthen this further. The ability to reduce those barriers again, to build up that positivity, to ensure that those trauma-informed approaches go not just through school but through the wider community, could be strengthened further with a more formal model rather than what we can make work in each local area of our country, where there are lots and lots of pockets of these things happening, but they're not happening universally, and we're missing opportunities. It was undoubtedly creating more responsive and a more proactive system to support our young people, to drive, to make our country a better, more effective, more tolerant society at the current time. So in conclusion, I know this is not a soft option. Trauma-informed practice, some people frown upon, they see it in tension with the drive for high standards. It absolutely, for me, is not that. It is about high standards. Having high expectations and challenging human personal behaviours is the best possible form of care we can give our teenagers when they're coming through school and in our wider society. To not approach it punitively, but to drive at the responsibility for one's own behaviour is to care greatly for the development of a young person. This is never a tick box exercise. It's never done. It's cultural change. It's transformational. And it requires us to take time, to think, to reflect and to inquire. But what it does do, I know, is it supports really effectively every individual in my school, but our most vulnerable pupils in society, and it puts them at the forefront of our thinking. We are not seeking to apportion blame or shame, but to show our young people and their families and our wider community how to take responsibility for themselves, to make choices that are positive ones, and support them to make changes for themselves which will be for the better. Not to tell them what to do, but to help them to reach those decisions collectively. I know our community policing partnerships are key to the wider success of this and the potential impact for trauma-informed practice in our schools, in local areas and nationwide. I know that through strong communication, through care, through compassion, and through driving that through everything you do, we achieve the highest possible standards of human behaviour, and we transform things for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jude.
Hi, I'm Steve Archer, and I'm sitting in Witton Park Academy, which is a high school in Blackburn in Lancashire, at 4:30 at the end of a long and interesting day. Please excuse me if there's no presentation behind me, no screens for you to look at, no slides for you to read while I'm wittering away. But I always kind of think it's best to do things authentically at the end of the day. I'd like to, I suppose, give you a little bit of background. I was in industry for 20 years before I ever came into teaching, and I'm now in teaching for 16 years, I think. And most of that time was spent with, although I've taught history and various other subjects in class, I've always been on the pastoral side, particularly dealing with young people and their behaviours in school. And around about 7 years ago, I got involved with kind of a bit of a movement, it felt at the time, to investigate the role of things like adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, in education, because similar work was going on in the health service, and it was happening with the police services in different parts of the country. And there was a need, I suppose, to look into the earliest interventions. So I'm in the UK in what's called a secondary school. The young people here are 11 to 16, by which time a lot of them have had a story which continues during the 5 years that they're with me. And we've had to, if you like, adapt as we've taken, I suppose, steps on the journey from ACE awareness through to being what I hope is a more trauma-informed environment. I think it's there's a large number of staff that have been on the same journey as me over the years. And that the way that we now respond to young people, communicate with outside agencies, including the police, local authorities, hopefully we're on a journey where these things improve to the point where we can not only serve our communities better, but equally that we can prevent some of the harm that happens to young people occurring in the first place. Now, I've got two main kind of things that I'd want to say today, and if you'll bear with me while I kind of explain them to you. The first thing is that, in my experience, education is a very, or the world of education, schools particularly, are very, very traditional, where in many ways a mindset that is recognisable to people of my age. I'm in my 50s. There are some aspects of education now, particularly attitudes towards behaviour, the use of sanctions, that I recognise from back in the day. And to be honest, I don't suppose that some of them have changed apart from the physical chastisement. You know, I don't suppose many of them have changed if I was to go back 100 years. The use of detention, the way that often schools wield an incredible authority over the lives of young people and the families that they come from. You know, a school has the power to send somebody away, to exclude them, or in my old-fashioned money, expel them, as it was said in my day. This is, for some, particularly for parents that have had their own, perhaps, negative experiences of education. I often say to colleagues that, you know, a teacher phoning at the end of the phone may as well be a police officer, because we have considerable authority over these people's lives. We can make decisions which absolutely turn their world upside down. We have the power to remove the young person from education, to send them somewhere else. And I don't think sometimes that in education we realise fully, or we don't fully appreciate quite how dramatic an effect we can have on people's lives. There is, therefore, I think, a responsibility on us to understand the story and the community from the young people who are coming from that we teach, serve. And part of that is understanding how their circumstances outside of education impact on their behaviours. And I don't suppose there's anybody here that would disagree with me that this new thinking could have profound impacts on the long-term health, the societal interactions, cohesion that we experience outside of our workplaces in our domestic lives. There are huge positives, I believe, if we can adopt a more joined-up approach in what I call in this country the public sector. You know, that schools, social workers, the National Health Service and police share information perhaps more readily, communicate better, so that when there are those transitions as people move from one stage of their education to another and then beyond into the adult world, that actually if we have been working with somebody over a number of years, that we would actually continue to work with them, or at least be aware of their circumstances, so that should they reach a crisis point, we're able to help them in the most efficacious way. It does feel sometimes, again, those traditional models where we perhaps are the only people we still coerce into behaviour are young people. We certainly wouldn't have this in, we wouldn't expect veterans in the military or people that work in the emergency services to be treated in such a, sometimes it seems to me, disdainful way. The second thing I kind of want to go on to really is that ACEs, there's an awful lot of attention around ACEs, and I'm quite well versed in the criticism in various professional areas about the over-reliance on ACEs. And I think for education, ACEs is just part of a picture of a whole, if you like. And I am always concerned that where we can identify risk, then we also, if you like, narrow our vision about those people that we'll help and intervene with. It's taken a long while, I think, for people to realise that sometimes having knowledge, and a convenient kind of knowledge in some ways, like ACEs, that we can't then use that as a peg to hang every type of behaviour and explain everybody's kind of life circumstances. There are, for me, a number of occasions where what would be to some people relatively minor things have had a dramatic and almost disastrous effect on somebody's life. On the other hand, there are people that, with great resilience and with very strong buffering networks around them, have been able to overcome numerous adverse experiences. ACEs does lend itself in some respects to being given a score, for people to have a number. And I do think that, particularly in education, there has to be great care taken. With justice services, with the police services, that we don't just ascribe a number and a risk, that actually we look at the individual circumstances. And I suppose that brings me in some respects to my final point. The idea that there is a one-size-fits-all punitive system, that we can have zero tolerance approaches to particular incidences in school. So it seems, sadly, increasingly, that particularly after the lockdowns and coronaviruses, and that young people and their access to things like narcotics is increasing. It's more commonly available, it seems to me, to a lot of young people in the areas that I work in. There are many schools that would have a zero tolerance approach to that. If we don't acknowledge the fact that some of these young people might be at risk of criminal exploitation, that by excluding them from schools, by sending them out away from our care, that we actually potentially send them into more harm, and, if you like, bolster the networks of criminals that are using our young people to distribute their product. At the same time, I would suggest there's a similar approach to things like knife crime. Again, in school, it's almost taboo, the idea that a young person would be carrying a blade must be, for the safety of everybody else, sent away from us. And of course, there could be many reasons why that young person is carrying a blade. If we don't look into the individual circumstances of these things, we may be making a grave error and putting a young person in grave danger. I think there's some radical thinking needs to happen in schools about what facilities we actually offer, and whether we truly can offer wraparound care and communication with different agencies so that a person can be supported in adversity through the different stages of their young life. I do feel a responsibility as a teacher to prepare young people for the outside world. At the same time, I also feel a responsibility to make sure that they're not a burden as they leave from our care. And I do think that increased, I suppose my main wish for all of this would be that where information is shared effectively, there can also be very effective interventions. And schools, with social services, with family support, with the National Health Service, with the police forces, I do think we can make effective partners. I do think sometimes, though, there is a reticence for us to share information, and we can think of very many different reasons not to, from confidentiality to kind of unprofessional pride in our own area, that kind of silo thinking, we're the only ones that know how to do it. But I do think that perhaps even if now things are individually led, hopefully collectively, people will open their eyes to the idea that we're part of one life journey for a lot of these young people. And seeing as we all touch their life at some point, then really we should all be working together to make their situation better. Schools are a really interesting place, and I'm glad I've ended up in them. And I do feel that the work that we've done around trauma, adverse childhood experiences, is perhaps the most valuable stuff that I've done. But it needs to go further, and we need to improve the universal conversation, speak the same language, so that actually we can communicate effectively to help reduce, if you like, the number of people getting into crisis situations. Thank you for listening. I hope it makes sense. It might come across as a stream of consciousness, but I've just come off an interesting day. So they're my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. That was great too. We're going to play the last video, but it might cut out early. So I think what we will do too is just drop all the videos into the chat for people to see in case they've missed any part of them because parts were blurry, etc. So I guess we can play the last video now.
Hello, so I'm ACC Leanne Kirk from Gloucestershire Constabulary, and I'm here today to talk about actions on ACEs in Gloucestershire. You're going to hear from myself, you're going to hear from Superintendent Emma Davis, Inspectors Emma MacDonald and Guy Blanford, and then lastly from Paul Stevenson, who chairs our Action on ACEs panel. And I'm going to concentrate today on how we have put ACEs into practice. So just to talk about our strategy, this is all about changing the questions and the conversations that we have with young people. So it's what's happened to you rather than what's wrong with you. Making sure that that happens in the community so that we are then starting to build hope with those young people, and we show them kindness and compassion, we listen, and that then starts to build resilience with those people. So who are their trusted adults? You'll hear a lot of that when we talk about the practical examples that we've done. Who is that person that somebody can trust and talk to and be their role model? And through that, building that community, the resilience, the hope, we then want to produce viral change. So how does that happen? Well, if we're all passionate about ACEs, and we all are, and it's that common language, and we have those personal connections with people and professional connections amongst all of us, and we want to feel part of that community, then actually that grows and grows, just like a virus. And this year of all years, I think we all know how a virus spreads, but this is in a good way. So this is that small set of behaviours from a small group of people initially becoming that bigger network of influence and producing that viral change. So I'll hand over to Emma now to talk through how we've done that.
Thank you. So as part of the strategic group, there were a number of things and an action plan that was created. And one of the things really was identify tools as per the image on your screen to aid people's understanding around what ACEs meant for them, both in terms of as an individual and also in terms of partners. So these are just examples of what we produced. And these were then taken and they were then piloted by a number of different agencies. And basically, the organisations and agencies, whether statutory, voluntary, or those within the community, actually use these to aid everybody's understanding in how ACEs can be applied to everyday activities. Now, these tools were also taken then to a voluntary association engagement event in September of 2018, then further taken to an engagement event for wider partnerships and a conference in November. And then in the December through to the July, we undertook roadshows across Gloucestershire and across the partnerships on voluntary and community sector to show how ACEs could be adopted and really try and progress that viral change and understanding. In addition to that, then one of the big elements around embedding this was around training. Now, the slide you've got on your screen will highlight different elements of training that were delivered both to the community sectors and voluntary sectors, but also to some of our statutory agencies. And Emma and I, who will speak to you in a moment, both were part of that training delivery. So we were training partners on behalf of the ACEs strategic group, but embedding that in everyday training activity and making sure people understood what ACEs was. And this enabled us to have that common language. And I think it's important to note that ACEs is a common language now in Gloucestershire amongst our partners and our communities. Thank you. And one of the things we did on those engagement events and from the conference was this pictorial. Now, this for me and others really represents a clear understanding of what ACEs is about, the impact on trauma and what we can do collectively and in collaboration to deal with and provide resilience to both adults and children. Thank you. Next slide. So for me, the stories of our success have been working in partnership, but also in the organisation. How we took this forward in the organisation in particular was introducing it into several areas of our work, which both Di and Emma will talk about shortly, and building that slowly and getting an evidence base of how we used it. We then promulgated that out to our partners and working with them, and you'll see some of the stories there. It cuts across all our statutory and voluntary and charity organisations. And it's provided a clear platform, really, on how we adopt ACEs and join that with other elements around becoming trauma-informed and also restorative practice. But I'm going to hand over now to Emma first to talk about Operation Mamouchi and how we then turned what we were doing into practice.
Okay, so putting ACEs and all the work we've been doing into practice, Operation Mamouchi is an example of that. So Operation Mamouchi was a mapped organised crime group where young people have been identified as being exploited by older adults in the community to deal drugs, both inside Gloucestershire and in the bigger cities. The recruitment that was taking place was by older males within our communities, and there were significant risk factors associated with what these children were doing. We then undertook a mapping sort of process, which is the picture that you see with all the little pictures on the screen in front of you. That process enabled us to identify who was involved and to look at the information that we had on those children. There was over 30 children involved in Operation Mamouchi. And we used information that we held on police systems initially to establish their ACE score. By doing that, it meant that we could focus on the vulnerability and the exploitation elements of this organised crime group. And by having a common language with our partners, it enabled us to coordinate a strategic meeting with partners from social care, housing, youth support team, and also people from the voluntary and community sector. We shared information at that meeting, which included the ACE score for the children that were involved, and wanted to win the hearts and minds of partners to get them on board with what it was that we were trying to achieve. It required a real change in approach from the police and also from partners to focus on prevention and intervention as opposed to sort of pursuit of the organised crime group that we traditionally have done within the police. That change of approach and using the common language of ACEs along with some pursuit tactics enabled us to reduce the overall risk of this organised crime group from one of the highest in the region to one of the lowest in 5 months. The approach that was used in incorporating ACEs and that partnership approach when dismantling an organised crime group was then recognised by the region as best practice, and the training has been delivered to other forces about how to adopt a similar approach in a similar situation.
Thank you. So a few other ways in how we've incorporated ACEs into our work here in Gloucestershire. Children's First is a deferred prosecution scheme for young people under the age of 18. A young person, when they've committed an offence, if they've taken some responsibility for that offence, they are eligible to come through to our Children's First panel. Now, the panel, again, is a multi-agency panel. We have police, social care, youth support team, victim support, Restorative Gloucestershire, and also the mental health service for Gloucestershire as part of that panel. And within that panel, we obviously hear the victim's voice throughout, but we also hear about the child who's offended. And we look at their ACEs and also how that could impact their behaviour. So we then create a bespoke programme through youth support team or Restorative Gloucestershire or whoever they're going to be working with moving forward, with the aim to stop criminalisation of children and to give them the best chance of a good outcome in the future and as adults. So when we sorry,
What do you have to say?
What do you say? Retake. Oh, so sorry.
No, don't worry.
Lost my thread.
So retake Children's First.
Okay, Children's First is a deferred prosecution scheme for young people under the age of 18 here in Gloucestershire. When a young person's committed an offence and they've taken some responsibility for that offence, they're then eligible to come through to Children's First. We hold a weekly panel, which is a multi-agency panel. It includes the police, youth support team, the mental health service, the victim support team, Restorative Gloucestershire, and we come together and we discuss each case. We hear the victim's voice during that panel, but we also look at the child who's offended. And as part of that, we look at their ACEs, and around their ACEs, we then create a bespoke program for each child. And we're finding that to be very successful indeed. The whole ethos of Children's First is to prevent reoffending and to reduce the possibilities of those children continuing to take the wrong path in life. So that has been really successful here in Gloucestershire, and I think we can say with confidence that we see the child first and then we see the offence second, and our reoffending rate is incredibly low here in the county. Thank you. We also have a project here called the Aston Project. Now, the Aston Project is a work for reward scheme for young people. It was set up in 2011 after Lynn Aston, who was a police officer who sadly died. Lynn was passionate about working with young people and ensuring that they had the best outcomes they possibly could in adulthood. So the Aston.
Hi all, it's going to stop in 1 minute, so I just wanted to thank you all for attending, and maybe now would be a good time to grab the videos so you can watch them if you want. Thank you very much to all the speakers too, and if you want to continue the conversation, you can do that on the WOVA platform. So thank you very much to everyone.
And I see also Ruby posted in the chat about following Th3 on Twitter. I just wanted to restate that because that one only sent to panelists. So just for the attendees as well, please follow Th3 on Twitter.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.